Oral exams are very often misunderstood, perhaps even misrepresented, by the people taking the exams, the people preparing them for the exams, and the people executing the exams. The simple fact is that the oral exam has one big difference from the written exam, namely that human reactions play a huge part of the outcome. In a written exam, nobody is evaluating the way that the questions are answered, only the actual results of the answers, only the answers themselves. Being nervous or acting out doesn't really affect the answers. But in an oral exam, all those things come into play and many more, which is why there are four things, perhaps not phases, but at least four levels to an oral exam that anyone taking it should be aware of, but that no one seems to be teaching, to my knowledge at least. The first level is basic knowledge. While it would be nice to have some solution for passing an exam without ever studying, that is still a bit utopian. You need some basic form of knowledge to pass an exam, no matter what the grade level you're aiming at. What you do not need to is to be an expert. There is a common misconception among students that they need to know every little nook and cranny, every little piece of detail about the subject that they're studying in order to get a good grade. That is not the case. To put it quite bluntly, nobody is looking for a genius. The people in the room with the student are not talent scouts. What they are looking for is someone who has paid sufficient attention during class to know at least the basics that they're dealing with in the subject. You don't even need to know everything in the basics. You just need to show that you have an idea what you're talking about, that you understand some of the elemental concepts of it, which, in all truth, isn't really that much when it comes down to it. For most students, simply having a basic level of attention or checking up on the books can be enough to get the majority of information they need to pass an exam when it comes to just the knowledge of it. So this is probably the one that trips up most students, because they focus so heavily on trying to know everything, or even worse, they try to know matters outside of the subject in order to show themselves as being knowledgeable in general. While a lot of teachers and examiners can be impressed or can be interested when something is pulled in from the outside, and even though in some places it is actually a part of getting the absolute top grades to show that you know something outside of the topic as it's taught, it's not what's being evaluated. What's being evaluated is, do you as a student have the knowledge that has been represented in class? Do you understand what was being talked about, and can you to some extent repeat some of the knowledge? To put it in a slightly crude and not entirely correct way, can you tell us what your teacher has told you during class? Now again, that is not as much as a lot of people think it is. Most courses most subjects are taught in a very simple manner, but the amount of things, the amount of subjects within the larger subject can sometimes confuse it. When you are taking an exam, you're not taking an exam in the entire course, and most everybody knows this, but a lot of people don't think about it. You are only taking an exam in a small part of it, and that is the part that you will be expected to know some of the basics about. You are allowed to have misunderstandings. You are allowed to lack some knowledge. What you need to do just show that you have paid some form of attention, or at least seem like you've paid some form of attention, and that you know some of the basic parts of the topic being discussed. Now, that is the first level, and many would like to think and like to make others believe that the majority of the exam is based on that, but it isn't. It's the foundation of it, true, but once that foundation is more or less in place, once the student has shown that he or she has at least some idea of what the topic is about, other things come into play. Now, the second level is a fairly simple but far too overlooked part of human communication. And the best way to sum it up is to make sure that you, as the student, seem comfortable. Nobody is expecting you to actually love the exam situation, but it is important to seem like you are not in a panic about having to talk about a topic. This doesn't have to be because you are very certain of yourself, or because you feel that you have complete control over either the exam or the topic being discussed. It is simply a matter of seeming somewhat comfortable with the company you're in. Being able to talk about something calmly and being able to say, I guess I understood it differently, instead of going into a fit of rage or panic or crying because you gave a wrong answer. That is actually a very important skill. It is not a show-off skill. It's not meant to dazzle anyone. It is simply meant to give people the idea that you are not entirely out of your league here. You are not a fish out of water. You're talking about something that you feel to some extent okay talking about, and you feel okay talking about it in a situation where it matters. It's unfair. It is brutally unfair. But fact is that anyone who seems more relaxed or more comfortable in the oral exam situation is likely to be judged better, simply because it will seem to those examining the student that the student isn't fumbling around blindly, and that the student didn't just read out everything the night before. It will seem more like the student actually knows and has paid attention on the topic involved. So it is, in a way, a subtle game of attitudes where it has to seem as much as possible as if the student is, maybe not has the upper hand, but is comfortable and feels right about what's going on, even when mistakes are made. Which is why very often the slightly cocky and less nervous student can pull off a better grade than a student who actually has more knowledge but is not good at communicating with people. As I said, it is extremely unfair, but it is a very deeply rooted part of human mentality, and it only really plays in oral exams because no one is looking at you, no one is listening to you in a written exam. In a written exam, there's only the answer, but in an oral exam, there's also the way the answer is given. Which actually leads quite nicely into the third level, because another part of seeing whether or not a student is simply repeating whatever he or she read the night before, or if the student is actually talking about something that he or she at least feels he or she knows about, is presentation. Now, this is not going to go into the clothes worn or whether or not your hair is put up right. this is not about looking smart in a image way. This is about how you present the things you say. And most importantly, it's about variation. If you are being asked about a specific topic, you can give a straight textbook answer, and it will give the impression that at least you read up on it. Or you can give a textbook answer and then provide other ways of describing the topic. You can do the classical, well, it's kind of like, and then explain it with an analogy or a metaphor. Or you can simply give different versions, different official explanations, or you can do something else entirely. The point is that when you can explain something from different viewpoints or in different ways, it seems like you're actually thinking about it, or that you have thought about it. Which people examining others like to feel. What you need to remember is that the people in the room with you, assuming that you're the student, the people in the room with you are human beings, and these human beings have worked usually for a lot of years on topics like the one you're talking about, and they have worked on those topics because, usually at least, because they actually enjoy them. They have an interest in the topic. And seeing someone show enough interest to actually try and go at a topic from different angles is, in a sense, very, not just comforting, but very confirming for someone who has invested so much of their life in it. It might not directly show an interest, but it shows enough of an interest from the student that the student is actually not just repeating stuff straight from a book. This is not an encouragement to find weird, bizarre, or utterly mind-blowingly creative metaphors for any little thing that you study, but being able to look at something from a different angle, which needs to be no more than talking to your friends and trying to explain the thing in a different way from the one that you all know from class. It needs to be no more than that. But showing that there has been some thought put into it, that it's not simply a matter of having read it and then continued to the next part, shows that there is more to the student than simply repeating knowledge. Now, the fourth level is somewhat odd, and I know from experience that some have a weird reaction to it. Some students have a weird reaction to experiencing it. It can best be summed up as idle chit-chat. Nothing with any heft to it, nothing with any great importance to it. It will usually be somewhat topic related, but it can be anecdotes or little jokes from anyone around the table. It can be the teacher telling a little anecdote from the student's work during the years in the class, or it can be an examiner telling a small anecdote from his or her own life around the topic or something related to the topic. This is not something that one has to understand, and it is usually a good sign when it happens. Again, the other people in the room are people, and very often the teacher, at least, is, if not as nervous as the student, at least a little bit on edge. Because what a lot of students do not think about is the fact that if the student performs poorly, this will also reflect poorly on the teacher, because it is, in the end, the teacher's job to prepare the student to be able to take the exam. And those nerves and stress, especially if it is one of the late exams, if a lot of exams have been run before this, with the same teacher, perhaps with the same examiner, a lot of stress and frustration needs release. And this will, unless things go very poorly, this will usually be a release in the form of relaxed chit-chat. When this starts coming up during an exam, the verdict has usually already been passed, and it will usually be a positive verdict. The examiner and the teacher are simply satisfied, and they feel comfortable enough in the situation. They feel that the student has performed, and they feel that they can now relax enough to go a little outside of the topic without, of course, straying entirely from it. What is important is that this situation must never be attempted to be forced into being. You should never, as a teacher or examiner either, but especially not as a student, try to force idle chit-chat into the conversation in the exam. This is something that might develop on its own, and if it does, should be welcomed. It is also not an encouragement for the student to try and match anecdotes. It is not an encouragement for the students to try to be entertaining or to try to put something extra into it. It is just people talking. And in essence, and this is something that a lot of students do not realize, but in essence, an entire oral exam is just about people talking. The only difference between that and a normal conversation is that there is more focus on the student, more attention is being paid to the student, and it is expected to keep the conversation on topic. The average oral exam, if it is a well played out oral exam, is very little different from a conversation on a topic that would happen amongst people who share an interest in the topic. It is, in the end, not that different from people simply talking about a subject. Now, of course, these 4 levels are, as stated, not something that you have to progress through, not 1, 2, 3, and then 4. They tend to be mixed together, but one tends to be focused on more massively before the next. Once there is enough focus on whether the basic knowledge is understood by the student, it will usually progress to seeing how comfortable the student is in the situation. Some teachers and examiners, especially if the student is performing well, will try to actually test deliberately whether the student feels comfortable, and after that test deliberately whether the student can present something in different ways. But most of the time it is about covering one thing at a time, but everything is still mashed together. You still need to seem to some extent comfortable while explaining the basics of it, and you may even have to explain something from different viewpoints while explaining the basic knowledge that you're supposed to have. But once the basic knowledge has been explained to some satisfaction, more focus will go on, is the student comfortable? Can the student present things differently? And if everything goes well in the end, simply idle chit-chat. There are plenty of things that you can talk about when you're talking about oral exams. There are study methods, there are ways to present knowledge. But if these 4 levels are taken seriously, and if the student, even before the exam, does his or her best to have that in mind, maybe prepare with that in mind, prepare separate ways to explain something, and have focus on relaxing instead of just focusing entirely on repeating knowledge, very often that will reflect in both how the exam runs and what the result of it will be. So I hope that will help some people out there pass their oral exams with better results and hopefully with a better experience.